bombing a country back to the Stone Age, a phrase that seemed to exist only in Cold War history, is now being echoed in President Donald Trump's tough statements regarding Iran. This rhetoric immediately evokes the past, specifically when former President Richard Nixon employed similar logic during the Vietnam War, hoping to use destructive power to force the opponent into submission. At that time, large-scale bombing campaigns were deployed to create maximum pressure, yet the outcome did not unfold as Washington intended. The repetition of language implying absolute destruction reveals a familiar motif in the strategic thinking of superpowers, using extreme threats as tools for psychological and political deterrence. However, history also demonstrates that such statements do not only reflect power, but sometimes expose its limitations. When military might is elevated as the central solution, the risk of underestimating the opponent's will to resist also increases. Therefore, the question is not only how long Iran can endure, but more profoundly, whether repeating the language that failed in the past is a sign of a strategy falling into a rut. In a significantly changed world, reapplying old mindsets may no longer yield expected results and could even push conflicts toward more uncontrollable consequences. Looking at actual developments, there is a clear gap between Donald Trump's declarations and the reality on the battlefield. In recent speeches, he has repeatedly claimed that the US military campaign is nearing completion, even describing Iran's military capabilities as severely degraded. However, at that very same time, Iran continues to launch missiles and deploy UAVs to attack US and allied targets in the region, ranging from Israel to military bases across the Middle East. Reality shows that despite the US conducting thousands of airstrikes and causing significant damage, Iran maintains a substantial counterattack capability. Furthermore, according to intelligence assessments, only about one-third of Iran's missile and UAV stockpile has been destroyed, with the remainder sufficient to maintain continuous pressure on the adversary. This explains why, after more than a month of conflict, there are still no clear signs of a ceasefire agreement, and the hostilities even show a tendency to expand. A familiar issue in modern warfare emerges here: the disconnect between political rhetoric and military reality. Statements of major victories or complete control of the situation often serve domestic and psychological goals, but fail to fully reflect the complexity of the battlefield. When the opponent still possesses the ability to strike back, the concept of victory becomes ambiguous, acting more as a discourse than a reality. Delving deeper, the use of phrases like "back to the Stone Age" or "wipe out" is not merely tough talk. It is a form of strategic language. It aims to create a maximum deterrent effect, signaling that the US is ready to use power at its highest level. In the short term, this rhetoric can exert psychological pressure on the opponent and reinforce a tough guy image before the domestic public. But the problem lies in the fact that this language of absolute destruction often brings counterproductive consequences. First, it narrows the diplomatic space because once a conflict is pushed to a life or death level, returning to negotiations becomes politically more difficult. Second, it easily increases the legitimacy of the party under attack, as they can position themselves as victims of a war of annihilation. And third, it contributes to pushing the conflict into an escalatory spiral, where each side is forced to prove they will not be intimidated. Looking back at history, the lesson from Operation Linebacker 2 during the Vietnam War clearly illustrates the limits of this approach. At that time, the US utilized massive firepower, mobilizing B-52s for intensive bombing to force North Vietnam to make concessions at the negotiating table. Militarily, it was a campaign of immense destructive power, but strategically, the result was not as expected. The US still had to return to negotiations and accept an agreement that was not significantly different from the previous one. The key point here is military power, no matter how overwhelming, does not automatically translate into political victory. In many cases, it only generates more costs, pressure, and resistance from the opponent. Modern war, therefore, is no longer a simple contest of firepower, but a test of will, endurance, and the level of loss each side is willing to accept. In the current context of Iran, this is even more evident. One side possesses superior military advantages, but the other side owns the capability for force dispersion, asymmetric warfare, and specifically a readiness to prolong the conflict. When these two factors collide, the outcome no longer depends entirely on who is stronger, but on who can hold out longer and achieve their political objectives. The inevitable question arises, can Iran do as Vietnam did? First, it cannot be denied that there are certain similarities between both US war campaigns. Both present-day Iran and Vietnam during the Vietnam War found themselves in confrontation with a superpower, facing a vast disparity in technology, firepower, and global military deployment capabilities. In this context, the almost inevitable choice is not to engage in direct conventional warfare, but to shift to forms of asymmetric warfare. Vietnam at that time utilized guerrilla warfare, flexible logistics networks, and external support to prolong the conflict. Today's Iran, while not organizing guerrilla war on its own territory, has built a similar structure in a different way. A network of proxy forces spanning the region, from Hezbollah in Lebanon and armed groups in Iraq to the Houthi forces in Yemen. This allows Tehran to avoid a full-scale direct confrontation while still maintaining constant pressure on the US and its allies. Additionally, Iran also aggressively utilizes modern asymmetric warfare tools, medium-range missiles, low-cost but effective UAVs, cyber warfare, and the ability to threaten strategic shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz. To some extent, this is an updated version of the mindset Vietnam once applied, using lower cost means to wear down an opponent with very high costs of war. However, stopping only at these similarities to conclude that Iran can repeat the Vietnam scenario would be an oversimplification. The differences between these two cases are the decisive factors. First is the international context. During the Cold War, the world operated under a bipolar structure, and Vietnam was part of a broader confrontation between two blocs. This meant Vietnam received significant support from major allies like the Soviet Union and China, both militarily and economically. In contrast, today's Iran operates in a more multipolar world, yet one that is also more complex and unpredictable. Despite its relations with Russia or China, Tehran does not have a clear and consistent strategic rear like Vietnam once did. Second is the factor of geography and war structure. Vietnam was a battlefield where the US had to deploy ground troops directly for a long period, facing a jungle environment, harsh climate, and an opponent capable of staying in place. Iran is different. It is a country with a large landmass and complex terrain, but the US has not yet deployed a ground war of similar scale. The current conflict primarily takes the form of airstrikes, long-range attacks, and actions through intermediary forces. Another point is that Iran itself is not Vietnam. The social structure, political system, level of internal unity, and the method of mobilizing the entire society for war are all different. During its war period, Vietnam built a very high level of mobilization and social consensus around the goal of national independence. Iran, while having certain elements of unity, also faces significant internal economic, political, and social pressures, especially under the context of prolonged sanctions. And finally, the United States itself has changed. After the lessons of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Washington tends to be more cautious regarding protracted wars, especially those requiring large-scale infantry deployment. This makes the current approach more standoff, relying more on technology, air power, and regional allies. This is a different kind of war with a different logic and therefore unlikely to lead to an identical conclusion to the past. From all these factors, an intermediate conclusion can be drawn. One cannot directly compare that because Vietnam won against the US, Iran will do the same. History can provide hints, but it is not a formula that can be applied intact. The history of the Vietnam War pointed out one thing quite clearly: military power, even if superior, does not guarantee a political victory. And in many cases, it is that very disparity that drives the weaker side to choose methods of coping that the stronger side finds difficult to control. The remaining question, therefore, is not just what Iran will do, but whether the US is inadvertently stepping into a familiar pattern, where power is prioritized. but the final result depends on factors outside the military scope. In a profoundly changed world, repeating old mindsets may not only be ineffective, but could also lead to consequences that even the involved parties did not anticipate.